Hello and welcome. My name is Victor Gijsbers and I teach philosophy at Leiden University in the Netherlands. It's been a while, but I'm making a series of videos, of which this is one, in which we look at Ludwig Wittgenstein's first major work, the Tractatus, or Logico-Philosophische Abhandlung, as the original German title is. In the previous video, we got to 3.263 of the numbered propositions, and in this video, we start at 3.3 and go all the way through the threes to 3.5. So here is 3.3. Only the proposition has sense. Only in the context of a proposition has a name meaning. So only the proposition has sense. And this could also be translated as only the sentence has meaning. Right? I mean, there's some choices of translation here. So only the proposition has sense. What does that mean? Well, to have sense, to have meaning in a sort of broad sense for Wittgenstein, is to be something that is about the world, that says something about the world, that claims to correspond with the world, and that can either correspond or not correspond with the world, and therefore can be either true or false. Well, what is the kind of entity that claims to say something about the world and that can be true or false? It is the sentence or proposition. And so it is fundamentally sentences and propositions that are the of interest to our philosophical analysis. Right? That's where correspondence with the world takes place. That is where truth and falsity takes place. And Wittgenstein goes as far here as to say that only in the context of a proposition has a name meaning. So the very idea of names, there's no such thing as a language that consists only of names that can't be combined into propositions. Right? That doesn't make sense for Wittgenstein. Names only make sense because they can be combined in propositions. Right? Names only refer to anything in the world because they can be combined in sentences or propositions that actually claim something and might be true or false. So that is the picture that Wittgenstein is giving us here. So he's really putting the sentence or proposition at the core of the logical analysis of language. So that's 3.3. Now, what Wittgenstein is going to do in the 3.3s is, at the most basic level, it is to introduce several terms and define those terms, and then use those terms to make more explicit how we should think about sentences or propositions. And so that's what he does in 3.31, is he introduces a term. In fact, he introduces two terms. He says this. He says, every part of a proposition which characterizes its sense, I call an expression, a symbol. So the two terms are expression and symbol, and they are introduced as being synonymous. And right after this, right after 3.31, Wittgenstein is mostly going to use expression. But for the larger part of the book, I believe he's going to mostly use the term symbol. In fact, already in the 3.3s, he's going to switch to symbol, and I'll mostly use the term symbol too. So every part of a proposition which characterizes its sense, I call an expression. Expressions are everything essential for the sense of the proposition that propositions can have in common with one another. So expressions are things that are essential for the sense of the proposition and that propositions can have in common with one another. In fact, that is going to lead Wittgenstein to the idea that we can identify expressions or symbols with the class of sentences that have that symbol in common. So, to take an example, let's take a sentence like, the cat is on the mat. The mat, right? The cat sits on the mat. That's maybe nice. The mat is a symbol. It is something that different propositions, it's essential to the meaning of the sentence, and it's something that different propositions can have in common. Right? The dog sits on the mat, or the cat plays with the mat, or I grab the mat. I mean, all of those are sentences which have something in common, and what they have in common is this symbol, the mat, which is essential to the meaning of all of them. And so we can even identify, Wittgenstein tells us, we can even identify this symbol with the class of sentences in which it occurs. So he tells us in 3.311, an expression presupposes the forms of all propositions in which it can occur It is the common characteristic mark of a class of propositions. A symbol is the common characteristic mark of a class of propositions, and so it can be, in a sense, identified with that class of propositions. It is therefore represented by the general form of the propositions which it characterizes, and in this form the expression is constant and everything else variable. So when I talked about the cat is on the mat, and I take the mat as the symbol that I'm going to keep fixed, that I'm going to keep constant, and I make everything else variable, so I can say the dog is on the mat, or I grab the mat, or maybe the mat grabs me. I mean, that would be weird, but okay. I'm letting everything vary except this one symbol. Okay. So here Wittgenstein introduces a new piece of terminology. He says that, well, what we have here, like this variable, is a propositional variable. He says an expression, this is 3.313. An expression is thus presented by a variable whose values are the propositions which contain the expression. So if I have a symbol like the mat, what I can do is I can take the class of all sentences that contain this symbol, like all sentences that contain this symbol, the mat. I can take that class and I can define a variable. Let's call it phi. Right? And I can say phi is a variable that the possible values of which are all the sentences of this class, namely of the class of sentences that share the symbol, the mat. So phi is a variable that takes as values all the sentences in this class, all of which share this symbol. I can identify all of these things with each other, right? I can identify more or less the symbol with the class, with the variable. And so an expression is thus presented by a variable whose values are the propositions which contain the expression. That is 3.313. Now, why is this interesting? Well, this is interesting, Wittgenstein thinks, because what I can now do is I can think of sentences, or rather of variables, of propositional variables, that consist only of things that are variable, in which nothing is held constant except a logical form. So let me make that more concrete. Suppose I have a sentence like, the mat is green. The mat is green. Okay, one thing I can do is I can keep the mat fixed and I can have the green vary. And so I create a whole class of sentences like the mat is blue, the mat is dirty, the mat is intelligent, and so on and so forth. Right? That's one thing I can do. I could also keep the green part fixed and let the mat vary. Right? And so I have a class of sentences that are the tree is green, the dog is green, the baby is green, and so on and so forth. I can also let both sides vary. Right? So I can say the is and fill in whatever I want in each of these two places. And so I would have a sort of sentence form in which I can have the mat is green, the cat is hungry, the baby is sweet, and so on and so forth. And that is the kind of thing where all reference to particular objects in the world has been done away with, and where only a logical form remains. Right? And so I have something that in logic I would write down purely in variables. In this case, if we use contemporary logic notation, I would probably choose big F, small x, right? Big F is, some function, so, or maybe a phi if I want to, phi x, right? Some property being predicated of some object, phi x. That would maybe be a way to write this down. It's a pure logical form, which is precisely the kind of thing that logic is interested in. Right? If I'm interested in logical proofs, if I'm interested in showing how one type of sentence follows from another type of sentence, I abstract away from all content, and here Wittgenstein gives me the recipe for doing so. What I'm doing is I'm taking out symbols and I'm replacing them with variables. And if I take out all the symbols and replace all of them with variables, then all I have left is a logical form. and then all I have left is precisely the kind of thing that I'm interested in when I am doing logic. So, this is at the end of 3.315, for instance. He says, here there's no longer anything dependent on any agreement. Like names are sort of dependent on agreement, right? I have to agree that this stands for that object in the world. But I cut all those ties by making everything variable. So there's no longer anything dependent on agreement. It depends only on the nature of the proposition. It corresponds to a logical form, to a logical prototype. And thinking through this notion of logical form is going to be one of the most important things for Wittgenstein in the Tractatus. So he's laying some of the groundwork for that here. Let us look at 3.32, where Wittgenstein introduces another piece of terminology. In this case, sign. So he says the sign is the part of the symbol perceptible by the senses. Or in the Percy McGuinness translation, a sign is what can be perceived of a symbol. So if a symbol is in a sense something abstract, so I used to say the mat, the cat, whatever, but actually it's sort of that which means that, right? Well, of course, in saying the mat, I am using a sign, in this case an audible sign. I could also have written it out, and in that case I would use a visible sign. So signs are that which makes the symbol perceptible by the sentence. If a symbol is given such a form that we can perceive it, we call that a sign. Now, Wittgenstein points out that signs are arbitrary, right? I mean, we can do whatever we want in a sense with signs. And that means that I could use several signs for the same symbol, or I could use one sign for several symbols. And there is nothing in the normal way that language operates that will stop me from doing so. In fact, Wittgenstein says it very often happens in everyday life that we use one sign for many symbols. And he gives in 3.323 the example of the word is. So he tells us that the word is appears as the copula, right? The copula, that's in a sentence like the tree is green, where the tree and green are sort of connected by the is. But of course, they're not claimed to be identical, right? I'm not saying that the tree and green are sort of the same thing. No, I'm applying a quality, green, to an object, the tree. So that's one of the things that is can mean. It can be the copula. It can also mean the sign of equality. So I could also say something like green is the color opposite of red. Yeah, that's right. Green is the color opposite of red. I think that's true. In a sort of color circle, right? I mean, those are really the same thing. The color opposite of red is just, in a sense, another name for green. So green is the color opposite of red is making an identity statement, right? It's making an identity statement between these two things. That's not the same thing as the copula, right? I'm not predicating some kind of property to green. Oh, well, green happens to have this property. Maybe it could also have... No, I'm saying that these two things are just the same thing, right? And maybe there are even more obvious examples of that, right? A third example of the use of is as the expression of existence, right? I could say something like the tree is, period. What do you mean? Well, somebody is worrying whether there really is a tree or whether it might be an illusion. And I say, no, don't worry. The tree is. Okay, not very common maybe, but we can do it. So one sign can be used as many different symbols. What happens, according to Wittgenstein, is that this frequently leads to confusion. So he tells us in 3.324, thus there easily arise the most fundamental confusions, of which the whole of philosophy is full. And here we see a recurrent theme in the Tractatus, which is that Wittgenstein believes that most of philosophy is just confused. Most of philosophy consists of people who are just misled by language into pursuing problems that don't really exist. How to solve that? Well, he tells us, 3.325, in order to avoid these errors, we must employ a symbolism which excludes them, by not applying the same sign in different symbols. and by not applying signs in the same way, which signify in different ways. So the first thing, not applying the same sign in different symbols, is sort of clear, right? We shouldn't use the word is for all these different things. We should use them. We should use different terms. And logic actually does use different ways of signifying the copula and existence and identity. So that's one thing we should do. And the other thing is we should not apply signs in the same way which signify in different ways. And so that basically means that, for instance, a name should be distinguishable in our notation from a property, for instance. So it shouldn't be, my notation should not allow me to use properties, the signs for properties, where I'm also allowed to use the names of objects, right? Because then we have, we get into all kinds maybe of philosophical confusions. Like when somebody says, well, does green exist? What does green exist? What do you mean? Right? Do you mean, are there any things that are green? No, does green exist? Right? And how does it exist? Well, that's precisely, I think, the kind of question that Wittgenstein wants to do away with. And the kind of analysis that he is going to offer is that he's going to say, look, existence is maybe fine when you apply it to the name of an object. You can say that this object exists. But we should have a logical language that doesn't allow me to use existence to apply it to very different types of signs. Signs for properties, like green. We shouldn't allow that, and then we are never misled into asking these kinds of philosophical questions. So that's what he wants to do, right? Or at least one of the things he wants to do maybe is to clean up our language. It's probably not the only thing that the Tractatus wants to do. It's certainly not the note on which the Tractatus ends, but it's here put forward as one of the aims of logical investigation, really. And he tells us at the end of 3.325 that Frege and Russell, right, the only two philosophers that he acknowledged any debt to in the foreword, that Frege and Russell are they already took steps towards this cleaning up of language, but they haven't completed it yet. So they are not too substantial, but I do want to say something about 3.326 to 3.328, because what we see here is that Wittgenstein is going to talk about use. And he tells us that in order to recognize the symbol in the sign, we must consider the significant use. The sign determinates a logical form only together with its logical syntactic application. So it is very common to say that Wittgenstein, in his later philosophy, when he's writing the Philosophical Investigations, breaks with the correspondence theory of the Tractatus, and instead comes up with the idea that meaning is use. Well, that must be an oversimplification of what is going on, because Wittgenstein is here literally telling us, in the Tractatus, that meaning is use. Right? That what a sign means can be seen only from how it's used. And he even goes as far at the end of 3.328 as to say that if everything in the symbolism works as though a sign had meaning, then it has meaning. Right? So if it's used as meaningful, then it is meaningful. Right? I mean, that's pretty close to saying that meaning is use. So this idea that use and meaning are sort of connected, and that signs become signs and have meaning and stand for symbols and so on, because they are used in certain ways, even though it is not a major concern of the Tractatus. I mean, Wittgenstein doesn't talk about use nearly as much as he's going to talk about it in his later philosophy, where he's talking about use all the time. It's still already there, right? The idea is already here at the end of 3.32. So, in the 3.33s, Wittgenstein is going to very briefly dispose of Russell's paradox. Very briefly. We can't go into all the details of what Russell's paradox is and how you might dispose of it and how you might not dispose of it, but let me explain a little bit what is at stake here and what Wittgenstein's basic idea is about how to deal with this paradox. So, Russell's paradox is most often formulated in terms of set theory. You might have the following idea when you think about sets, right? You think, well, if I think of some property, right, any property, then I can also think of a set of all the things that have that property. So let's make it concrete. Green, the set of all green things, right? I can think of green and then I can think of all the green things and put them together in one thought, right? So I have one thought of all the green things, which is a thought of the set of green things. Okay, the set of green things, the set of odd numbers, the set of people, the set of books written by Wittgenstein, and so on and so forth. Doesn't seem very problematic. And so you might build a set theory that has this as a sort of axiom of existence. If you have a predicate, then there is a set which contains precisely the objects that fit this predicate. What Russell's paradox shows is that this goes wrong, that this leads to paradox. And Russell does it by considering the following predicate. The predicate is a set that does not contain itself. So let's think of all the sets, and then we can think of sets as, there must be two kinds of them. There are sets that contain themselves, such as the set of all sets, right? The set of all sets must contain itself, right? And there are sets that don't contain itself, such as the set of all green things, because a set doesn't have a color. So the set of all green things is not a green thing and doesn't contain itself. So far, so good. But now Russell says, okay, well, what about the set of all sets that don't contain themselves? Well, suppose that the set of all sets that don't contain themselves doesn't contain itself. Well, then it's a set that doesn't contain itself, and so it ought to contain itself. On the other hand, if the set of all sets that don't contain themselves does contain itself, then it's a set that contains itself, and it shouldn't contain itself. And so we can prove that if it contains itself, it doesn't contain itself, and if it doesn't contain itself, then it does contain itself, and paradox. And if you want to hear more about this, you can search for Russell's paradox, or you can, there's a fine, less mathematical version of it that is called the barber's paradox, which is about a barber, a male barber who shaves all men who don't shave themselves. And it's a little bit more concrete, but it's the same idea. So, this is a problem for certain forms of set theory, and it was a problem for Frege's formal system, which is one of the reasons why Russell was interested in it. So, how to solve this? Well, here's what Russell basically does. He says, I'm going to make a hierarchy of sets, right? And he calls this the theory of types. And so there are sets that contain things, and then there are sets that contain, like, the first kind of sets. And then there's sets that contain the second kind of sets, and the first kind, and the things, maybe. And then, so we have a hierarchy such that no set can ever contain itself. We can also apply this same procedure to languages. We can say, well, okay, so there's one language which is just about objects, right? Let's call it the object language. And then we add a layer to the language that is about this language. And we call it the meta language. Actually, the first would be called the object language because the second is about it. But okay, so there's a second layer of language that is about the first layer. And then there's a third layer maybe that is about the second layer. But what we do is we never let any sentence talk about itself, but only about sentences on lower layers. Both of those procedures in the set theoretical version and in the language version get rid of self-reference. And in getting rid of self-reference, they get rid of things like Russell's paradox. And when we think about language, they might get rid of things like the liar's paradox, right? The sentence that says, this sentence is false. Right? If it's false, it's true. If it's true, it's false. Paradox. But that's a sentence that refers to itself. If we don't allow that, we don't have those kinds of paradox. Okay, so here is what Wittgenstein says. He says, well, you don't really need that. You don't really need Russell's theory of types. All you need is this logically good language that I'm creating here. Because a logically good language shows you how to apply every sign, and thereby it ensures that the kinds of paradoxes that Russell runs into can't occur. And Wittgenstein doesn't give us nearly as much detail maybe as we would like to, but he does give us this example in 3.333, where the idea is basically that if I have two functions, and one of them is applied to a sort of first order function, something that immediately, one of them is applied to a sort of sentence that is about an object, and the other is applied to a sentence that is about a sentence that is about an object, then these are two different grammatical roles. So sort of the hierarchy of types is here turned into different grammatical roles. And because Wittgenstein wants to give things that have different grammatical roles, different signs, he tells us that, in his perfect language, there could never be the kind of self-reference that Russell needs for his paradox. Because you could only get that kind of self-reference if one sign can apply to itself, but then it's playing two grammatical roles that must be different. Because one, for instance, this one, the inner one, applies to a first-order sentence, and this one applies to something that applies to a first-order sentence, and so it must be a different grammatical role. Now, again, I don't think Wittgenstein gives us a lot of details, and you could have a very long discussion about what he's trying to do, whether it would work, and whether it would even be enough, because it's not immediately clear that all forms of Russell's paradox have to take the form of self-reference. But this is the basic idea of the 3.33s. So I will move on to 3.34. Let's see. 3.34 tells us that a proposition possesses essential and accidental features. Accidental are the features which are due to a particular way of producing the propositional sign. Essential are those which alone enable the proposition to express its sense. The essential in a proposition is therefore that which is common to all propositions which can express the same sense. So there's something perhaps too contingent about the sentences that we normally use for real philosophical analysis. So here's an example. John and Mary go shopping. Mary and John go shopping. Shopping, Mary and John go. Mary goes shopping and John goes shopping with her. John goes shopping and, you get the idea. There are many ways to express the same thing. Right? And if I'm interested in sort of philosophical analysis rather than poetic or linguistic analysis, this isn't very interesting to me, right? I want to abstract away from this variability. So I want to extract away from what Wittgenstein calls the accidental features of a proposition towards the essential features of the proposition. And that's where things becomes interesting. So this also means that I'm going to abstract away from, the differences between different particular languages. Because English and French and Dutch and German and Chinese or Mandarin, Cantonese and so on and so forth, right? They all express in different ways, but they're only sort of accidentally different, probably. At least that's more or less Wittgenstein's idea here, I would say. All the differences between different natural languages are accidental. That's not what we're interested in as philosophers. We're not interested in English or German or Cantonese. We're interested in the basic elements of language, the basic ways that language work, that allow it to express the things it expresses. And so here Wittgenstein tells us that this is an abstraction that we want to make in philosophy. So one of the examples he gives is he talks about the fact that we can build up basic logic out of a different choice of fundamental logical connectives. So for instance, you can build up basic logic out of not and or. You can also build it up out of not and and, or not and implication, or the so-called Sheffer stroke, and so on and so forth. There are many choices you can make there. And it's, in a sense, some of them might be more pragmatically useful. Nobody wants a logic that's based on the Sheffer stroke alone, except for Wittgenstein, as we will later find out. But that's just pragmatics, right? That's not really what we're interested in philosophy. So we want to abstract from all of that, and we want to say, well, what do all these notations have in common? That's the one thing that we're interested in. We're interested in sort of the underlying abstract shape, which is what all these specific concrete notations have in common. 3.4. The proposition determines a place in a logical space. The existence of this logical space is guaranteed by the existence of the constituent parts alone, by the existence of the significant proposition. The geometrical, this is a little bit later on, the geometrical and the logical place agree in that each is the possibility of an existence. So here Wittgenstein is returning to a metaphor that I discussed in one of my earlier videos, where I said, well, we can think of logical space as sort of a bit like a geometrical space, except it has probably lots and lots of dimensions, maybe infinitely many, I don't know, lots of dimensions. And every point in logical space is one way that the world could be. And every proposition tells us that the world is some way or another, and thereby determines, well, usually not one point in logical space. To determine one point in logical space, we would have to give a full description of the world, like every detail. We never do that. But it cuts out some area of logical space. So if I say the cat is on the mat, I'm saying, well, in all of logical space, I exclude the parts where there is no cat, or there is no mat, or the cat is not on the mat. And all I'm including is this part of logical space where the cat is on the mat. And then maybe I make another claim. I say, the dog is hungry. Well, maybe here, this is sort of the part of logical space where the dog is hungry. Okay, so that's, I exclude everything where there's no dog, or the dog isn't hungry, or whatever. If I say both the cat is on the mat and the dog is hungry, I've sort of limited now the available part of logical space to the intersection of these two spaces, right? The space where the cat is on the mat and the space where the dog is hungry. Those are the only options that are left. And so on and so forth. And by asserting more propositions, I can make this space smaller and smaller. So when Wittgenstein tells us that the proposition determines a place in logical space, that's, I think, what he means, right? A place here is not one point. A place is an area of logical space. And when he tells us that the existence of this logical place is guaranteed by the existence of the constituent parts alone, he is basically, and this is something we talked about in the previous video, telling us that if the proposition is significant, right, then all the names in it must refer. And so all the things that it talks about exist. And of course, these things are going to be fundamental constituents of reality, like these simple objects. So the simple objects exist. And the simple objects can be combined in all these different ways that are the different points of logical space. Right? And so by having this significant proposition, we also have the guarantee of all these possibilities. And so the existence of this logical place is guaranteed by the significant proposition. If it's significant to say the cat is on the mat, then there must be this possibility of the cat being on the mat. So that must exist. But much more must exist, right? All of logical space must exist. Also the part where the cat is not on the mat. Because those same simple objects can, of course, combine in different ways. And that's what Wittgenstein tells us a little bit later, where he says at 3.42 that although a proposition may only determine one place in logical space, the whole logical space must already be given by it. And this also points back to this idea of the Parisian model, right? If I say the cat is on the mat, not only am I sort of indicating this bigger logical space where the cat is not on the mat, I'm even sort of giving it form, right? And if we think in terms of cats and mats, we are thinking of cases where the dog is on the mat or the cat is on something else and so on and so forth. If we really zoom in to the level of the simple objects, the elementary objects, then of course we are thinking about all these different constellations that there are. So, this brings me to 3.5, and I think 3.5 is best read in conjunction with 3, because we are still sort of looking at what Wittgenstein's explanations or explications of 3. 3 was this: the logical picture of the facts is the thought. The logical picture of the facts is the thought. And here's 3.5. I'm scrolling back down to 3.5. The applied thought propositional sign is the thought. So the logical picture has transformed into the applied thought propositional sign. What Wittgenstein has done is he has explained to us what a sign is, what a propositional sign is, that it must be applied in order to have meaning, that it allows us to think all of logical space, and so we now, hopefully, have a better understanding of what 3 means. Like this logical picture is an applied thought propositional sign. That is the thought. So far for the propositions number 3 and beyond. Next video we're going to look at the 4s. Thank you.